Greetings. My name is Lukman Azeez. I am an associate in the Appellate and Litigation Group. Here with me is Peter Hung.
Hi, this is Peter Hyun. I am a government investigations partner where I do congressional investigations, state AG investigations, and DOJ and regulatory and law enforcement investigations here at Wiley Rein.
So on this podcast, we'll be discussing the HBO mega series Succession, which chronicles the Roy family, dysfunctional owners of a global media and hospitality empire called Waystar Royco. The show chronicles its children while fighting for control of the company amidst uncertainty about the health of the company's founder and CEO, Logan Roy.
So the way that this idea for this podcast came up is that the most recent episode, and this is a huge spoiler alert, so if you have not yet watched the episode, please turn it off or just go ahead and proceed with caution. There are going to be tons of spoilers within this podcast episode because in episode 9 of season 2, which is titled DC, the Roy family comes to Congress and the company, Waystar Royco, finds itself in the crosshairs of congressional investigators. And by and large, most of the show's episode is set in D.C. and filmed in D.C. And it goes over how the family and the company is navigating this investigation.
That's right. And now we are actually going to examine what the show got right, what it did not get right, and any other analysis that Peter and I have. Peter, can you cover what you think the show got right in this episode?
The first thing is I was incredibly impressed with the show. I think their consultants did an excellent job. There was tremendous nuance in the way they talked about congressional investigations, the way they talked about Congress. Point number one, as to what they got right, I think it's this point that congressional investigations can start literally from anywhere. It can start from a news account. It can start from a whistleblower. It can start from a tragedy. It can start from anything and everything. And this is couched in Congress's broad powers under Article 1 to investigate not only the executive branch, but even private industry, how the laws should be changed. And really, this is couched in its legislative function. Here, when the story opens, the scene is set with a 60 Minutes type piece where a whistleblower that's inside or was formerly inside the Waystar Royco Cruises division comes forward and is interviewed by 60 Minutes. And the family is all huddled around the TV watching this episode. And it basically shows this whistleblower who has come forward. Whistleblowers can go directly to the media that will then lead to an investigative report. Or, a whistleblower can go directly to Congress. There are whistleblower protections for executive branch officials, but also this happens with some regularity where if there is misconduct in any industry or in the executive branch, they can come forward to Congress. So I think that was one point that they got right, was that congressional investigations can start from anywhere.
Exactly. And as soon as news of the congressional investigation came to light, the show does a great job of displaying how tense the Roy family is and how tense the room was. Can you sort of shed some light on that scene and how incredibly high the stakes were?
Yes, and I think that goes to point number 2, was that I think what they got right was portraying just how high the stakes are when it comes to congressional investigations. If you'll recall, going back to the opening scene, while the whistleblower is speaking to the news reporter, Logan Roy, the main character, played by Brian Cox, just a spectacular actor, he turns off the TV and, lets out this guttural, I can't take this and watch this blankety blank anymore. And when Roman Roy, his son, pipes up and speaks back, shouldn't we be watching this to develop a response? Logan Roy points to him and basically says, I have 50 bleeping people paid to watch this blank. And in the other room, the camera pans out to this other scene, and within earshot are quite literally 50 other people watching the news reporting come out. And this team, this war room gets together, and right after the episode, there's somebody named Carolina who works in the PR function. She comes running up with, talking points to Logan Roy saying, okay, these are the talking points. There's no proof. There's no victim voices. Hearsay. And at that moment, in that separate war room, all of a sudden, Siobhan Roy, which is the daughter of Logan Roy, comes in, and she has a political background, and she basically comes in and he says that, well, Congress is calling for hearings. it's the Senate Commerce Committee, probably the House too, and the congressional staff are huddled on how to choreograph the hearings, and they're going to roll this congressional probe into tourism regulatory hearings, and essentially highlights what this means, that now Congress is now calling for hearings. At that moment in the scene, it sounded like it was bipartisan. But when Shiv mentions that, Roman again pipes up and he says, well, can't we just tell Congress to bleep off? And Shiv looks at him kind of incredulous. And this again goes back to how high the stakes are, because Logan Roy basically highlights this later in a scene in private when he's on the stairwell with Roman Roy. And he basically tells Roman that 10 minutes in front of Congress, and if it goes bad, it could spell the end of the company.
That's right.
And when Roman says, well, can't we just tell Congress to F off? The reason why he can't do that is because if, for example, the private company that has investors and the company itself was subject to a hostile takeover bid at the time, the share prices could sink every single day that a senator or a congressperson goes to the media cameras, goes to the media and says every day that we're being stonewalled, that we've called Logan Roy, but he's blowing us off. And essentially that would lose confidence in the company itself. It would lead to a bunch of theories that maybe the company's hiding something. So really the options confronting Logan Roy in confronting this challenge that looks like an existential threat to the company really becomes really significant, and they need to develop a strategy as to how to deal with it.
That's right. And that strategy is throwing Bill Lockhart, the former head of cruises of Waste-Irago's cruise line division, under the bus. You know, Peter, the show doesn't really get into the nuances of the preparation, but in terms of what it did get right, can you speak to whether the preparation was adequate in terms of portraying what actually does happen?
Yeah, and again, this is another thing the third thing that I think the show really got right, and I think it was encapsulated in the scene where it cuts from that initial 60 Minutes type piece, and then it goes to basically the congressional hearing itself. And in the minutes leading up to the congressional hearing, Tom Wambsgans, a pretty, Mr. Darcy for some of you out there, he was basically going to sit on the first panel of witnesses as the now current head of cruises. And he's stressing out, and he turns over to the general counsel, Jerry Kellman, and he says, can we do it one more time? And Hugo, who also works it appears as a communications director type position, a communications guy, he turns back to him and he gives actually a really nuanced understanding of congressional hearings. And he says, look, Tom, you have been murder boarded to death. You are prepared. Meaning that in the days leading up to a congressional hearing, and this is actually the vernacular that one would use when they're preparing a high-level executive to appear before Congress, is you go through these murder boards. You know, even with debate prep, this happens all the time where, deposition prep, when you're preparing a witness for any significant activity, you murder board them. You put them in the hot seat and you go through it over and over and again. But what was interesting about what Hugo said is that he also said that, look, this isn't a courthouse. This is a stage. And I think that was significant because it also revealed that congressional investigations are dissimilar from regular law enforcement investigations insofar as things get played out in public. And he was saying it's a stage and you need to remember that. But he also says to Tom, you need to filibuster. And I thought that was very insightful as to the process of congressional hearings, because typically each member on the dais on both sides of the aisle typically gets about 5 minutes to ask a witness questions. And there's a clock that starts to run right when the question is asked. And what Hugo says to Tom is he says, every minute that you are eating their blankety blank, you are stealing from them. So eat those bleeping minutes. And I thought, again, that scene, that exchange was very prescient as to how it encapsulated how a congressional hearing occurs.
Absolutely. And that was an extremely insightful scene. The show then pans on to the actual room of the Senate. And from the head of the Senate hearings, Setting Senator Gilman, to the crowd what aspect of that depiction do you think the show got right, to the extent that it did get it right?
Yeah, I thought they did a great job getting the feel of the room. So in general, and even for example, the insight to be able to say, yeah, that they could specify that this was the Senate Commerce Committee. And the Senate Commerce Committee, for those in the know, in the Senate, there are 20 such standing committees, and each committee has its separate jurisdiction. And the Senate Commerce Committee does indeed have jurisdiction over tourism, regulatory issues, interstate commerce issues. It's been in the news quite a lot as of late with respect to the techlash issues. Right now, there are 26 members on the Senate Commerce Committee, and it's led by a chairman named Roger Wicker. But what was interesting was that in the show, what it depicted was that the Democrats were in the majority. In other words, when they recognized the chairwoman, she was a Democrat, and so was the main questioner, a guy named Gil Avis, was a Democrat. And all of the Democrats sit on the left side of the dais. From the witness's vantage point, that would be on the right side, and all the Republicans sit on the left side of the dais. And I thought that it was very interesting how they portrayed that feel, the feel of, going from a Democrat questioning the witness to a Republican questioning the witness, because there is this. When the play is being enacted, there's, the acts that follow are basically each side of the dais gets 5-minute rounds of questioning. And that is pretty much what had played out here. So I thought they got the feel of the room really, right.
With respect to the actual hearing, it was extremely extensive. It began with Gil Avis' question and Tom Wambsgans, and I was surprised by the level of preparation of the Senator, Gil Avis, and how extensive and detailed his questions were. Now, is that something you would typically expect from a Senate hearings? Or what level of detail do you think would typically be?
Yeah, I think it would depend. And I think this is a good place to sort of talk about what they got wrong, what the show I thought got wrong. And I think many of what they got wrong was due to the storytelling purposes. In other words, that the showrunners were trying to tell the story here. And I think they kind of truncated quite a bit into a narrow piece of timing. So I think the first thing that they got wrong, and I think this goes to your issue or to your question, is with respect to timing. I think the scenes, the way they cut from initially the whistleblower report to all of a sudden this congressional hearing. And what's missing is really the investigatory stage, where documents are produced to the committee, where witnesses and whistleblowers are perhaps interviewed by the committee, where the committee itself is probably drafting more and more correspondence to get third-party witness interviews and whatnot. Because I think what the hearing portrayed in the show was that Gil Avis had a tremendous amount of insight into the company. So the first thread of questioning, when he's asking about this guy, Lester McClintock, who used to be friends of the Roys, and it's still a mystery as to how close he was to Logan Roy, but he was the main guy that was engaging in this sex trafficking ring. He had Gil Avis did, incredible insight into the emails that were being reviewed. And as you and I know, as litigators and as, fact finders, doing that type of fact-finding work takes an incredible amount of time. So even those brief moments where Gil Avis is questioning on that thread about Lester McClintock, but also on the other thread about how Tom Wambsgans treated Greg and whether there was a cover-up with the destruction of documents, that type of nuanced detail, it's hard for a congressional investigator to know that without having gone through months and months of painstaking document review and interview witnesses. And so I think for this story, it showed it in a very truncated space, but that was a pretty a significant showing by that senator, and it takes a tremendous amount of staff work and just time to go through all those volumes of materials to come at even those sophisticated questions that really put Tom Wambsgans on his heels. And I think when Tom comes back into the war room and he starts speculating, oh, did somebody throw me under the bus? It's because I think he was thinking at the time, or at least the implication was there an insider in Waysar Royko, who somehow fed the committee this intel to come at me with these questions that I was not prepared for. That was the implication as I saw the show.
And, there were two panels of four witnesses here.
Mm-hmm.
The first panel was Jerry Kelman, the general counsel of Waystar Royco and Tom Guns. The second one was, obviously Logan Roy, the CEO of the company, and his son, Kendall Roy. Now, can you speak to how plausible it is that sort of the top two executives of this mega organization would be the ones to essentially testify?
Yeah, I thought that was also another instance as to what they got wrong. But again, I think the showrunners did this for the storytelling purposes. I think in all likelihood, for example, don't recall any congressional hearing where there were multiple executives on two different panels from the same company. In a single hearing, it is more likely that the first panel you might hear, for example, from a whistleblower himself or herself. And then the second panel, you might have, the chief executive officer or, someone of a lesser executive role. And I think in general, in these hearings, obviously Congress wants to call the top person. But sometimes the top person may not be in the know as to what exactly, and can answer with certainty some of the questions that will be asked. But I did think that having two executives on the first panel and two executives on the second panel for a single hearing, I think also, if you think about it, committees may not want that also, because it then requires, it's as if you're doing 4 different depositions in one day. And that, preparing for a single deposition, as lawyers know, takes a tremendous amount of time. You have to know the documents. And, for a trial witness, for all those purposes. And when you are then in a high stakes environment, questioning 4 different executives, I think even committee staff and committee members themselves may not want to do that. But I think in many different oversight settings, there are a succession of hearings. And so it comes as no surprise that during the episode, when Shiv goes and she basically finds out that there's another hearing that's coming later in the week, and that hearing is going to feature another whistleblower, that's big news, and that's pretty plausible itself to have a succession of hearings. But yeah, having 4 witnesses at once, I didn't think was usually the norm.
I'm actually glad you brought up the whistleblower that Shiv got in touch with, and I think this is a nice segue to talking about that interaction. So a couple of questions on this. To what extent do you think it's plausible for, number one, Shiv to have found out what a whistleblower was so quickly? And number two, that the whistleblower herself would make herself available to talk to essentially the people she would be testifying against?
Yeah, I thought that was also one thing that the show got wrong. But again, it was for the storytelling purposes, is that I think what you saw in the show was that Shiv was in the background, using her personal contacts to figure out intelligence. And in Washington, sometimes, information can be like currency. And she somehow, following the first round of hearings, she, through her contacts with Gil Avis, goes and confronts him and tells him to back off and, tries to barter with him, and then uncovers somehow that there's this other whistleblower, a woman named Kira. And Logan Roy basically urges her, as well as Rhea, the newly named CEO, to try to get this other whistleblower to back down. And Shiv is then tasked with finding this whistleblower, and finds her, oddly enough, at a local jungle, playground with kids. And so I did think that was pretty implausible. Usually that information is very, 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 very tightly held, especially for something of this magnitude, particularly if, Gil Avis saw this as their star witness. At some point, typically, the party who selects that witness has to divulge that to the other side of the dais. So here, the Democrats were in the majority. The fictitious Republicans were in the minority. At some point, the Republicans would know. But the fact that Shiv would find her and so openly speak to her, I thought was also kind of a stretch, because, the other thing that committees can investigate is not only the underlying conduct, but it's also any type of obstruction of the committee's work. So, for example, if Waysar Royko, retaliated against a whistleblower, or here, once Congress finds out that Kira doesn't want to show, Congress itself could call, Shiv Roy and say, we want to talk to Shiv and we want her to testify under oath what she told Kira, whether she tried to railroad her, or, what Logan Roy, what did your father tell you to do? So those are all elements of a fact-finding inquiry that makes the dynamics incredibly sensitive. But I think here, for the storytelling purposes, again, I thought that interaction with Kira was very fictitious, but I think for the storytelling purposes, it kind of showed what might happen.
Absolutely, that makes sense. So after Shiv's interaction with Kira, the show pans out to the aftermath of the Senate hearings. And you have Logan Roy coming in and essentially to this loud round of applause and making his rounds. Did anything in particular about that scene jump out at you?
Yeah, I thought that was also sort of the other thing that I noted would be something they got wrong. I think it's rare to have a company basically having a victory lap after more hearings can be called. I know that the hearing with Kira was called off at that point, but to have that large of a presence, and it looked like they used the Senate room for them to host, and then you have the Republican congressman the Republican senator who was the ranking member of the committee. Senator Roberts. Yeah, he comes up and he congratulates Kendall Roy, says, Kendall, you did a great job here. I thought that type of event might be a little more private, but the way that it was kind of featured as this victory lap, because again, and this kind of gets to a much broader point, that whenever anyone's called to Congress, not only is the hearing itself a stage, but so are the steps leading up to the hearing, and so is the aftermath of the hearing. So in other words, if news leaked out that somehow Waysar Royko was holding this huge victory lap celebration where everyone was toasting Kendall Roy and celebrating that Kira was not going to testify, that in itself becomes a huge news story. And it also becomes, again, this question of, what was the aftermath? Was there any obstructing going on by Waysar Royko? So I think congressional investigators can look at that. But I also say, for example, like leading up to the hearing, appearances matter. And, one of the things that the show also probably got wrong was, having Connor Roy sit right behind Logan and Kendall Roy while they're testifying, and having him like fist pump and, celebrate after Kendall Roy's answer and clap back to Senator Gil Avis. I thought that was something that typically, companies would be more mindful about, to say like, hey, we don't want anything that would subject us to criticism. We're not going to fly there in a private jet and come with our, $1 million coats and watches and whatnot. So I think that was something that the show also got wrong.
Absolutely. And in terms of, if you can explain briefly how nuanced of a process this is, and from the commencement of a congressional hearing to the actual process of navigating the hearing to the conclusion, this seems to be a process that requires multiple strategy. It requires some sort of tactic and being, and I think as Tom's testimony reveals, being prepared. And it seems like you have obviously extensive expertise in this space. Can you talk about the level of preparation and the depth of knowledge that's required to navigate an issue like this, Congressional?
Yeah, I think it shows just sort of the multi-dimensional issues that are at stake. You have not only legal issues, protection of privileges, constitutional authority, documents and trade secrets and parallel investigations and things like that can lead to multiple legal issues. But you also have a number of issues that affect the company's perception, its reputation. You have the political angle that you need to have some sophisticated understanding of. Where are the political headwinds going with respect to this matter? Where do we see And I think the show encapsulates that in several instances where Logan Roy, is trying to get intel from what he asked Carolina, his PR guy, where are the Florida guys, the implication being the Florida senators who can somehow jam up this hearing. There are other political instances where, for example, you had the Senator Roberts, who was the ranking member, a fictitious Republican, who's all of a sudden throwing softball questions to Kendall. And, back in the war room, they're like, oh, we can now breathe a sigh of relief because we know Roberts is going to be very friendly. And he says, oh, your cruises are wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's that multifaceted approach that's absolutely required and requires a level of sophistication with respect to how Congress works to understand the nature of an investigation. And as we mentioned, an investigation could start from anywhere, and it could be member driven. It could be driven by the staff. And, there could be informal document requests. There could be formal document requests that could, ultimately devolve into formal compulsory process through a subpoena, for example, for testimony or for documents. The Senate Commerce Committee, it requires bipartisan cooperation for such subpoenas. And, so there's different strategies that one might be able to employ or to think about and think through as they're confronted with a congressional probe.
Oh, that's helpful. So any additional insights that you have and would like to share with us?
Sure. I thought a couple of other insights, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, was I thought what was incredibly interesting was the exchange with Logan Roy when he is testifying. The show has portrayed him throughout these 2 seasons as this planet of a character, just incredibly powerful, direct, and even when he's not in the room, he affects people's behavior in just such strong ways. And yet when he appears before Congress, he has this certain meekness. And in his prepared testimony, he says, I'm very sorry. I won't forgive myself for this, that this happened. And we're going to do an investigation and we're going to make things right. And he comes off as incredibly meek and apologetic. And there's this ambiguity as to why he's doing so. And you could tell that Gil Avis wants to bring out of Logan Roy that attack dog, that guy who's so fierce and so strong that he knows that the public will turn against him. But Logan sort of defers, and he actually lets Kendall become the attack dog.
That's right.
And it's interesting. Kendall does a good job of this, and he basically accuses Gil Avis of being, ideologically driven and anti-news and, pro-state media, all these accusations, and everyone in the war room's clapping for Kendall's performance. And it was just interesting, that ambiguity, because I thought when Logan Roy comes back, and it seems that he did this on purpose, because later when they're in the room after the hearing itself, he goes up to Kendall and he kind of apologizes to Kendall. And he says, everything good? And Kendall is kind of confused, like, yes. And it's sort of a callback to Logan's testimony, and also foreshadows what comes, late at the final scene when he says, look, we're going to have a blood sacrifice here. And it's this narrative thread coming. Oh, maybe he strategically did that. And clearly Logan prepared for this hearing with an objective in mind as to what he wanted to portray. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on that too.
Absolutely. And the notion of there being an ambiguity is definitely true. With respect to Logan apologizing to Kendall afterwards, it seems like there are 2 things doing the work here. One is Logan seems to throw him under the bus, right? So when Gil Avis begins to question about the sort of misdeeds of the cruise line at a specific point in time, Logan says, I wasn't, in charge of operations, but my son was. So I think, one way to read is sort of ex post apology is to say that he's apologizing for throwing him under the bus. But I think your explanation is also credible, which is essentially apologizing for something that may come around down the line. So absolutely. Actually, I was also interested in getting your insight into Kendall's testimony and him not necessarily answering the substantive questions that Gary Avis had, but sort of rebutting his questioning on ideological grounds.
Yeah, I thought that his testimony was a reflection of how this is a stage. And, he deflected from really answering the questions and instead going on the attack. And this can be a strategy that a witness uses. And apparently Kendall had it very clear in his mind that this is what he wanted to accomplish. He wanted a viral moment that would play into the supporters of Waystar Royco, play into that base of support by saying Gil Avis is an ideological guy. He doesn't really care about the sex trafficking victims. All he cares are about these ideological games to take down my father's business. And this is a personal issue, not a substantive one. And he clearly takes on that angle. And it is a strategy that's obviously very high risk, and it can be, obvious, it can come with some costs. And I think later in the show, although the company is celebrating Kendall Roy's performance in that regard, Logan, seems to understand that in the long run won't help us, and that their support may erode over time, even if they continue to take that approach. So I did think that was a pretty sophisticated, nuanced, again, storytelling that the showrunners did there.
Absolutely. Any additional insights?
Yeah, I think the other thing too is that with congressional investigations, what becomes clear is that there can be other offshoot parallel investigations. And I think the scenes from the next episode kind of, foreshadows that when they say, oh, the SEC may be looking at this, a regulatory body, DOJ will be looking at this, and they'll be looking at it under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and various components of DOJ may even look at it, whether it's, the Consumer Protection Branch, the Fraud Branch, the Civil Fraud Branch. I mean, there are so many different investigations that can come from a congressional investigation and spin off from there. So I think that's another thing that the show was reflective of. Another, insight about the actual show itself was I thought that they were very interesting. It was very interesting because, howsoever which way you like to paint it, I think the showrunners wanted to portray the Democrats who were in the majority in the Senate as having, the moral compass here, in that they were attacking Waystar Royco and corruption, and that the Republicans were trying to carry the water for it. And I think that was the fictitious account here. But it was also interesting, for example, like if you did a screen grab of Gil Avis, and, the same way that I mentioned that on the left side of the dais were all Democrats, and the chairwoman was a woman, and next to Gil Avis were a bunch of women senators, the implication being that, it was more diverse on the Democratic side. And then when you did a screen grab of Senator Roberts on his side, they were all, older white men. That was something that I think the show was portraying there. Interestingly, another thing that I'd like to mention is that in a congressional hearing, the other thing that people should know is that throughout a hearing, committee members are coming in and out. It's not like everybody's there at attention. Maybe at the beginning of a hearing, everybody is, if it's a high profile one. But throughout the day, committee members are shuttling in and out because they have votes on the floor. They have other committee business that they need to attend to, and meet with constituents, etc. And I thought the last thing that was kind of cool about the show, and this is for all the non-DC insiders, is that, committee hearings are typically held not in the Capitol, but in the Senate, for example, it's held in any one of the 3 Senate buildings, which is really cool. They did not film the actual scenes in a Senate building. I don't know where they actually shot the scenes, but what was interesting was the signage within the buildings where they shot the scenes were exactly accurate. There are 3 Senate buildings. The first one is the Hart Senate Office Building, which was built in 1982, named after Senator Philip Hart, who was an 18-year senator from Michigan. and it's architecturally different from the other two buildings. The other building is, the Senate Dirksen building, which was named after Everett Dirksen, the minority leader from Illinois. In 1972, that building was built. And then the last was the oldest building is the Senate Russell building, which was built in 1909, named after Senator Richard Russell. And what's interesting is that, Leader Schumer for the Democrats recently, introduced a resolution to try to rename that building. But I thought that was really kind of cool for the Washington insider geeks. So, but yeah, those were my additional observations. This was a ton of fun. And thanks for listening.